Please turn your attention to Sunrise as we celebrate the
It was only active for 7 seasons, but 20 players who once suited up in the World Hockey Association are now members enshrined in the Hockey Hall of Fame in Toronto. That list is headed by Bobby Hull, Wayne Gretzky, and the father and son duo of Mark and Gordie Howe. More than 800 players earned a good living playing professional hockey in the WHA. Some 60 NHL players followed the lead of the Golden Jet to play in the Upstart League in the fall of 1972. 44 coaches, 12 referees, and 36 linesmen saw their dreams of a professional career in hockey realized because of the WHA. Yet without the vision of Dennis Murphy, none of this would have been possible.
Some of the teams that went into the National Hockey League have done very well, and I'm happy for them.
This magnificent concept by Dennis Murphy not only produced hundreds of jobs for pro hockey players, but also tripled or quadrupled the salaries available in the NHL of the early 70s. His creative thinking also produced sudden death overtime, now a staple in the National Hockey League, and opened the doors to North America for dozens of European players. This quiet, unassuming visionary had a dream, and as a result, Dennis Murphy forever changed the landscape of professional hockey as we know it today. First impressions of the old World Hockey Association, formed back in the early 1970s, were those of a poorly funded league comprised of unruly rookie teams of brutal, bruising, and uneducated thugs, as well as juvenile teenage dropouts lacking skating talent, in addition to barbarian Swedes, Finns, and Czech players. In reality, nothing could have been further from the truth. Without that questionable upstart and this so-called semi-professional league, as it was often called, there would be no Edmonton Oilers, who won several Stanley Cup championships, no Winnipeg Jets, no Quebec Nordique, no New England Whalers, and no sudden death overtime periods in today's pro hockey. In fact, the WHA showcased veteran Hall of Fame legends such as Gordie Howe and Bobby Hull, as well as having been the first pro hockey league to sign rising superstars like Wayne Gretzky and Mark Messier. Not only that, without this new WHA league, all professional hockey players today would have been forced to remain with their initial draft team forever and receive salaries equaling mere fractions of today's pay. Without the WHA, Europeans and Russians might not even be playing in today's NHL. Even though the NHL and WHA merged in 1979, it's fair to say that the current playing style, rules, and player makeup of today's NHL is an outgrowth of the WHA, which changed forever the face of the NHL. Every hockey fan today who enjoys the thrill of sudden victory overtimes, the fruits of free agency, along with the teenagers and Europeans playing in today's NHL, owe it all to the World Hockey Association. The WHA forced changes upon the NHL and molded it into the worldwide sports powerhouse that it is today. It is now time to give this World Hockey Association League, maligned and ridiculed since its birth in 1972, its due credit in pro hockey history. This is the WHA's side of the story. Before the World Hockey Association, life for pro hockey players was vastly different than today's multi-million-dollar contracts and lucrative product endorsements. The average NHL salary in 1972 was about $25,000, the lowest of the 4 major pro sports. It's no secret that many players believe that the NHL unfairly controlled international hockey by suppressing the markets, the pro hockey pay scale, and the hockey league's profit-sharing system.
The NHL never had any competition, and I thought many times about going to Europe because of the way they were running things. So I said, we are getting the dirty end of the stick. Someone is making too much money, and we, the players who put on the show, we need to make more money. So that's how I felt about the structure of the NHL at that time. not many of us were very happy with the salaries that we were making.
I'll be honest with you, I was, after my playing days in Detroit, it was not a fairy tale. They put me in a room and I called it the mushroom treatment. Kept me in the dark, and every now and then come in throwing manure on me, and that's the way I felt. I was totally unhappy.
The NHL controlled everything, and they kept salaries secret. You're like, what are they trying to do?
But I don't mind saying they were stodgy. They were very set in their ways. At the time the WHA was formed, you had what you call a perpetual reserve clause. It means as if you had a one-year contract for $15,000 a year, which would have been pretty good salary in those days, even though it was only a one-year contract, you were bound to that team forever.
But that was the control that they had at the National Hockey League level. I mean, it was like $7,500 if you played in the National Hockey League. It was silly in a way. I mean, there was so much, there were only 6 teams at that time. And then even the amount of expansion didn't open the doors.
There were many smaller areas in Canada and the United States that deserved to have professional hockey. And of course, if the NHL didn't think that that was what should be done, then they closed the door on them. And I thought that a lot of these areas needed to have some professional hockey.
The arrogance and belligerence of the NHL created disharmony among the players in the league, as well as anger among the cities wanting to showcase pro hockey teams. The World Hockey Association was the sole vision of Dennis Murphy, who recognized the need and opportunity for a brand new pro hockey league. He had previously created and founded the American Basketball Association in 1967, along with his 2 partners at that time, Don Regan and Gary Davidson, and thereafter founded World Team Tennis and Roller Hockey International, along with several other pro sports leagues. After creating and founding the NBA's arch-rival league, the ABA, which directly expanded pro basketball into many newly created markets, Dennis Murphy returned to his hometown roots in Southern California.
Coming back from Florida to California, my dad gave up a lot just for his family because he loved all of us so much, but he was really bored. With the success of creating the American Basketball Association, my dad was now proficient at creating leagues, so he said, why not hockey?
Dennis Murphy quickly realized that several other cities across the U.S. and Canada wanted badly to have professional hockey teams fill their arenas. But with the old-fashioned NHL set in their ways, there was no hope of seeing new expansion teams or innovative changes to pro hockey's antiquated style of play. So Dennis took it upon himself to create an entirely new league to compete directly with the NHL.
What happened and what inspired the World Hockey was this wealth of talent that were veteran players that were qualified to play in the National Hockey League. There weren't enough teams and there weren't enough opportunities. And so World Hockey was a natural sort of groundswell coming out of the game itself. And Dennis was able to recognize that. They were able to recognize that that need was there.
Dennis was quite a promoter. He could sell ice cubes to an Eskimo, I'm sure. And he very innovative with his thoughts. He had a lot of connections out there, and he always put people together that seemed to gel. And in my mind, he is one of the best, greatest promoters I've ever met.
Dennis came to me and said, there's only one league in hockey, and I said, well, let's start one. Now, I had never seen a hockey game before that, and I knew nothing about hockey.
I would say Dennis's kinetic energy and his Rolodex were amazing, and his imagination. Dennis really understood what he could do and what he couldn't do, which is really, really a good thing. So he'd do a deal and then he'd move on and let somebody else take over.
Dennis united with Gary Davidson and Don Regan to found the World Hockey Association in 1971, despite Davidson's and Regan's total lack of hockey knowledge. They quickly recruited Bill Hunter, president of the Junior Western Canadian Hockey League, and Ben Hatskin, a Canadian sports businessman. Murphy, Hunter, and Hatskin traveled across North America recruiting potential owners, and by September 1971, had announced that the league would begin in 1972 with 12 teams, each having paid $25,000 for their franchise. At first, the NHL hardly recognized the new competition.
They again took us lightly. I don't think they thought we were going to make it, but we did. And there were only 6 teams in the NHL at the time. They didn't think anybody would be a competitor to them. But I always knew that we had the makings of a great pro league with my relationship with the hockey guys in Canada, Bill Hunter and Ben Hatskin. And they, together with my pro league business partners, Gary Davidson and Don Reagan.
Well, there's no question. Dennis, he was the #1 guy. He persuaded a lot of businessmen throughout North America to become part of the WHA.
The toughest thing for Dennis, and he was really good at this, was deciding who is real and who's not real. Sports is like sex, politics, and religion. Everybody's got an opinion. And so everybody will step up and act like they can do it. And the hardest thing to do is figure out who's real and who's not real.
Dennis Murphy called me and asked me if I would attend a meeting with potential owners of the New York franchise to be called the New York Raiders. They were under the illusion that Dennis was there to hire them as lawyers. As a matter of fact, we almost got physically thrown out of the place. And at the last minute before they literally told us to leave, Dennis turned to one of the guys and said, "Oh, and by the way, would you like more information about the forthcoming WHA?" And one of them said, "Send us whatever you want, but get the hell out of here."
When we walked out of the meeting, I looked at Jerry and said, "You know, I think that the meeting went pretty well, Jerry." He looked back at me and he was in complete shock because he thought that these guys didn't want anything to do with us.
About a month later, my assistant came in and told me that Mr. Murphy had called, inviting me to a press conference at Gallagher's in New York. I went to the luncheon, and when I walked in, the guys who threw us out of the office were sitting up at the podium, and Dennis announced them as the new owners of the WHA franchise in New York, the New York Raiders. I looked up at Dennis, he looked back at me, and he winked. So I think the story is that Dennis could do the impossible.
When you start these new leagues and you're dealing with a constituency of 12 different owners who all had a diverse point of view, it took a real good politician and a good people person to keep it together, and that was Dennis. That was his gift.
Dennis was what I would call in Texas a wheeler dealer, but he was very fair, he was very upfront, and Dennis was always fair to me, and I always enjoyed being around Dennis. He was always a thrill to be around, he was always encouraging, he was always an uplift.
Creating entirely new leagues in direct competition with stuffy, traditional, and conservative leagues was Dennis Murphy's greatest strength. The WHA attacked the very core of the NHL, which was vulnerable due to its own arrogance and refusal to adapt to the new environment. The NHL ignored hungry, opportune new markets, big and small, monopolized the Canadian players, and excluded the European athletes. As a result, they created a void for the WHA to fill. While most people tend to only remember the fighting, brawling, and wide-open skating of the WHA, serious changes to hockey as a whole were in the works. Public perception seemed to side with the game-changing nature of the WHA. As a result, the NHL couldn't simply close their eyes and hope the WHA would just disappear.
The way it was when we got involved, that if you were like a 14-year-old kid in Canada and you're a pretty good hockey player, you'd be signed to one of the junior contracts, and you never were free from that 14-year-old contract. These kids were basically in servitude from the the first contract I signed.
Without getting into the underbrush of legalese, everything that's in a contract has to be definite and certain. And if the salary to be negotiated next year is not definite or certain, and it's a key part of the contract, then it's not a contract. So I said, I gave a written opinion, and I was pretty comfortable after having these guys. I said, that's not a contract, so let's go out and sign anybody we want. So we did.
I think it probably started, the World Junior Tournament that year in December, January was in Montreal. And I was lucky enough to make the team, and he sat me down in Montreal after about 5 games and said, you know, here's a contract. Being that I was only 16 years old, I was like, all right, where do I sign?
The new WHA League was never considered much of a threat to the prestigious NHL at first. But after declaring war on the perpetual reserve clause, the WHA proved that nothing about the NHL was sacred, including its players. The upstart league targeted the best the NHL had to offer, hockey's golden jet, Bobby Hull. Hull, who considered moving to the WHA merely as a negotiation tactic with the NHL's Chicago Blackhawks, had jokingly told WHA's Winnipeg Jets owner Ben Hatskin that he would only move to the WHA for $1 million. At that time, a ridiculous amount of money for any sports athlete. But then, something funny happened on the way to Chicago.
I was the first $1 million athlete of any kind. And it was all in jest. I said, how about this? I said, how about if they gave me a bonus of $1 million, then they'd have themselves a hockey player. Now, not thinking real clearly, just wanting to get them off my back and kind of saying that as a jest. Ha ha. Give me $1 million and you've got yourself a hockey player. Knowing at that time there's never been a $1 million player of any kind.
He was given $1 million check for a signing bonus. Everybody was meant to kick in their pro rata share. And when it came time to ante up, only 4 franchises did. Winnipeg and us, we came up with it. 4 people came up with $250,000. I don't remember who the other 2 were, but it was huge for the league.
And then this check next to the right there is the bonus we gave to Bobby Hull to sign. That was the largest bonus ever given to an athlete at that time, and his story was on the front page of every paper around the world.
Signing Bobby Hull helped bring immediate attention to the fledgling WHA League. Because the WHA also promised much higher salaries than the NHL, at least 61 top-tier NHL players were attracted to the league before opening day and gave the WHA instant credibility. Bobby Hull ultimately agreed to a 10-year, $2.7 million contract with the Winnipeg Jets, the largest in pro sports history at the time.
We are of the belief that you need a star. You need some stars. And then Bobby, in turn, we were right, because Bobby went and got 61 National Hockey League players to join us. The fact that because he joined us, because he was a star, all the other guys said, you know, if he does it, then these guys must be for real, and so they joined our league.
Well, you know, when you see a player of Bobby Hull's talent, his name, his recognition, you see him jumping from the National Hockey League to the WHA, it made it a lot easier transition for people like myself to make the move as well.
I know that one organization in the NHL, after I signed, went to each one of their players and upgraded their salaries 3 times without asking questions. That was just one team in the NHL. And Makita, he says that he bowed to the West every time that before he went to bed, thanking me for raising his salary.
John Bassett, who owned the Toronto Toros, he came to me one day and he asked me what I was making with the Toronto Maple Leafs, and he told me he wanted me to jump to the Toronto Toros. And he said, what are you making? So I told him, and he just looked at me and says, I'll double your salary and I'll give you a 5-year contract. I said, are you serious? He said, I'm dead serious. And that was the negotiations for me to jump to the WHA. They wanted some name players, and they went and got them.
Thanks to people like Dennis Murphy, salaries in professional hockey went from 25, 30,000 to 75 to 100,000. I think that was one of the reasons the National Hockey League had such an anger towards Dennis and the WHA, because they created a much higher salary structure.
By the time of Bobby Hull's signing with the WHA, the NHL just began to grasp the stark reality that the WHA was here to stay. The rising new league was becoming all too successful in siphoning away many of the NHL's best players. In order to prevent further mass defections, which were debilitating the NHL, several NHL teams attempted to prevent players from joining the WHA by filing numerous lawsuits and seeking restraining orders to prohibit their play. Against the backdrop of the rough-and-tumble WHA games, the legal maneuvering played out in ways best described as surreal.
They looked upon us as, who are these upstarts? I mean, they were offended by us. They didn't like our style because we were loose and we were renegades. We were outlaws. They were more established and structured. They were Wall Street. I remember being in San Diego at a league meeting, and we heard this pounding on the door, and it was a sheriff with a huge box of lawsuits. I mean, we went through stuff you wouldn't believe with the different owners.
The WHA and NHL took their puck war to the courtroom. The NHL's Chicago Blackhawks were successful in obtaining a restraining order on Hull and the Winnipeg Jets, pending the outcome of legal action in the federal courts. Several other lawsuits were filed against each WHA team in every city where the WHA played. Things got pretty ugly.
I mean, WHA was the Wild West. I remember we played the New York Red by the end of the year. I don't know what they were, and one of the players was handcuffed at the end of the game, not on our team, but on the other team, and dragged out into jail because of some lawsuit or something. But I remember in his uniform.
But rather than back down, the WHA welcomed the opportunity to challenge the reserve clause in U.S. federal court so that players could partake in free agency. The courts placed Bobby Hull's case on the fast track as the showcase test. WHA's Don Regan almost single-handedly challenged the country's biggest law firm, hired on by the NHL, to slug things out in federal district court. This was definitely a modern-day version of David and Goliath.
So then we went around, and I did a lot of research, at which I was pretty good, and decided that Philadelphia was the best plaintiff's antitrust venue in the United States. And there was a sole practitioner there who was a pro at and among the best in the United States at pursuing antitrust violations, and his name was Cohen. So I called him, we had a war chest, he and I took on the NHL, and we had a 17-day trial.
We got a black judge down in Philadelphia by the name of Higginbotham. And I'll never forget what the judge said. Nobody owns nobody. And as soon as Judge Higginbotham said, nobody owns nobody, I said, the ball's in our court now.
In November 1972, the Philadelphia U.S. District Court ruled in favor of the World Hockey Association and Bobby Hull, placed an injunction against the NHL, preventing it from enforcing the reserve clause, and thereby freeing all players under restraining orders, including Hull, to play with their WHA teams. The decision ended forever the NHL's heavy-handed monopoly on all professional hockey talent.
No one had ever challenged these guys before. I was the first guy that ever challenged them and beat them. And of course they didn't like it, but it was stupid of them to challenge me at that time knowing what the results could be. And by them challenging me and the WHA and yours truly winning the lawsuits, I cost them $1 billion.
It wasn't like when Curt Flood sued on his own behalf and said, hey, my contract is no good. This was universal across the entire hockey empire. And so in essence, the reserve clause as it existed in the NHL was knocked out.
But obviously the money was a great attraction, and when I finally did jump, I was getting a little older at the time, and I looked at it as being a new experience. So the WHA did a great job for all hockey players. I loved playing in the WHA.
Another huge bonus to the WHA occurred when hockey superstar and icon Gordie Howe, nicknamed Mr. Hockey, came out of retirement just to lend his talents to the NHL's rival league.
Gordie's wife, Colleen, who has passed away unfortunately, she always had a dream that Gordie, who was 40 years old at the time, would play on the same line as his two sons, Mark and Marty. I signed Gordie and his two sons. So it was the first time in hockey, at least, that we had a father play on the same line as his two sons.
When that opportunity came to play, and she negotiated all 3 contracts, and when that contract was made, then we moved on. And it was a gamble, but it was a good gamble. It paid off, and I guess I was the only one that had doubts. She had no doubts I'd make it, and the boys thought I would, so it was fine.
The fun thing for me is when Gordie came in the 73-74 season and was going to play with the 2 boys, I was fortunate enough to sit between the 2 kids in the dressing room across from Gordie. That was amazing, that experience, just being in the dressing room with somebody who grew up and was a legend in the game, and to see Gordie interface with the 2 boys. I can remember it seemed to me that it was unique. Not too often you're in a dressing room where somebody says, hey, Dad.
And Marty and Mark, with their ability to leave the junior ranks and jump in and play very well in professional, give me an opportunity to fulfill my dream. That was to play with them. And I was the only one I was worried about because I knew they could play, but could I? And it was the most healthiest attitude I've ever, and togetherness I've ever been in.
That move got us in our league, outside of the Bobby Hull signing, I think most probably the most publicity of anybody. It was a great thing for the league because when we went on the road, instead of having 4,000 or 5,000 people, they'd have 10 or 11,000 because of this. Gordie and his 2 kids added that much to our league.
So all of a sudden everything dropped into shape, and from that point on it was history, and I felt wonderful. And instead of 1 year, it went for 7, so that's how much I enjoyed it. It was like a togetherness, and I think every one of us. That's why we were such a good team, and why we won. Out of the 4 years we were together, we won four of the major cups in that place.
Another WHA tactic was to acquire young, hotshot talent to play pro hockey alongside the established veterans. And the WHA knew exactly who to go after, kids like Wayne Gretzky and Mark Messier.
Then we got a call from Nelson Skalbania, the infamous Nelson Skalbania, that he wanted me to fly to Vancouver to sign me. When I got to Vancouver, spent a weekend with him, and it was at that point in time he asked me if I wanted to play pro hockey, and I told him yeah. And he signed me to a contract that weekend.
We had a guy by the name of Nelson Skalbania. He bought the Indiana franchise, so he took Wayne in the first year.
As we went along in the first month, Nelson Skalbania saw that it probably wasn't working, and it wasn't probably the right area, right city for me to be in, and to be 17 years old to try to carry a franchise. So he basically called me one day and said, I'm going to trade you or sell you. I haven't decided where I'm going to sell you, Winnipeg or Edmonton, but I'll let you know. It's funny now, pro hockey doesn't work like that anymore, but we actually got on the airplane. When we boarded the airplane, we still at that point in time were not sure where we were flying to, whether it be Winnipeg or Edmonton.
the National Hockey League really wanted it bad. So we moved him to Edmonton. And of course, everybody knows today, Wayne Gretzky, number 99, he made our team in Edmonton the team that it was.
Gretzky was a great, amazing young hockey player. I think that's one of the magical things about the WHA. You had players that were legendary as at the end of their career. You know, guys like Bobby Hull and Gordie Howe, great players, but it was also the injection of the young players, the 18, 19-year-old kids that came into the league that had so much talent, including Gretzky. And that was one of the magical things about the league.
The WHA was the Wild West. Like, we had 8 kids that were 18 years of age. Like, some of them became Hall of Famers and incredible hockey players. But when they're 18 years of age, they're learning the game.
The Whalers are a good example of a team led by Jack Kelly, who when they started, gosh, I think we had 8 or 10 college players on our team. That's a lot.
It was because of Dennis's genius at figuring out that you put in a cornerstone of established older talent, you mix it with young phenoms that are going to take over the sport. And so you always try to get a legend that would get you the headlines and the phenom who would get you the crowds. And Dennis was a master at that. It was like watching a magician at the Magic Castle.
In 1974, one of the ways that the WHA wanted to match up the quality of their players with the quality of the NHL players at the time was when Canadians Ben Hatzkin and Bill Hunter came up with the idea of a continuation of the Summit Series, which was a competition between Soviet and Canadian professional ice hockey players. Canada was to be represented by World Hockey Association players instead of National Hockey League players, as it had been in the 1972 series. WHA players had been banned from playing in the 1972 Summit Series. Bobby Hull, who had just jumped from the NHL to the Winnipeg Jets, had been named to that Canadian team, but was not allowed to participate. The 1974 series was an opportunity for Hull and 46-year-old Gordie Howe to play for Canada against the Soviet team. The format was the same as the 1972 Summit Series, with 4 games in Canada and 4 in Moscow. The Soviet team won the series 4-1 over Canada, with 3 games tied.
Even though the Russians won the series, our players showed the world that our league was just as good as the National Hockey League and matched up well with the Russians. As a commissioner of the WHA at that time, I traveled to Russia and saw all the games, and I was so proud of our players. This series brought more credibility and legitimacy to our league and was a tremendous public relations bonus.
In that same year as the WHA's Canadian-Soviet Summit Series of 1974, major changes were happening in North American professional hockey. With 2 leagues competing and battling for the best hockey talent in the U.S. and Canada, both leagues started to notice a shortage of suitable players in North America. However, only the WHA found a solution and took action. In 1974, due to a depleted talent pool, the WHA began the pioneering and visionary move of employing European players in large numbers, a tactic the NHL failed to embrace up to that time. The new WHA talent included such stars as Swedish players Anders Hedberg, Ulf Nilsson, and Lars-Erik Sjöberg, along with Czech center Vaclav Nedomansky. Winnipeg especially loaded up with Scandinavian players and became the class of the league, with Hedberg and Nilsson combining with Bobby Hull to form one of hockey's most formidable forward lines, quickly named the Hot Line. The Europeans came to America with a reputation of being far more fit, aggressive, and bold in their style of play compared to their North American counterparts.
The skill level of the Europeans really came to the fold, and they changed the game. Unfortunately, they taught us what meant to be in shape. They got like about 6% body fat on them and could bench press 350 pounds. Like, who are these people? But it started changing the game, and obviously we had to catch up to them.
That was a big difference, they were honest, tough guys. They weren't trying to cheap shot guys. They weren't trying to run guys after whistles. They weren't trying to cross check you in the face. They were just honest, tough guys.
But the WHA tried to open up the game a lot, so I think that might have been the biggest difference. Is the emphasis was on scoring goals, creating more excitement, and giving the fans something to cheer about.
We had the biggest goon team ever assembled down there. We had 5 players that none of them played over 35 games, and they all had 250 minutes of penalties. If I hadn't been there, I mean, we'd have killed somebody. Like, I absolutely stopped 100 fights that year.
And the police were on the ice, and the police chief went running on the ice to get him in the middle of the hockey game because he had a warrant from a brawl in Calgary. And I remember we were sitting on the bench, and I was going, what is going on over there?
One night, it was actually Thanksgiving Day. At the 18-second mark of the first period, a brawl broke out, and it took 45 minutes to get the game going again.
Bobby Hull, attempting to act as a peacemaker for one fight, was brutally charged from behind by the Bulls' Steve Durbano, who had left the bench or had been sent with one thing in mind. That precipitated a bench-clearing brawl and created an ugly mood amidst the crowd. At least a dozen police reinforcements had to be called in to break up mix-ups between the Birmingham players and the fans. There were reports of at least one arrest and of a scuffle between a radio reporter and Bulls coach Glenn Sonmore in the Birmingham dressing room. The Bulls had been involved in a similar incident earlier in the year in Winnipeg that resulted in a league record $10,000 in fines. But obviously,
it was the most bizarre thing I've ever seen. Man, it was roller derby city, I'll tell you what. A lot of great memories.
Another major change made by the WHA's co-founder Dennis Murphy and Edmonton Oilers owner Bill Hunter was the inclusion of an overtime period called sudden death in regular season games. When the WHA was founded, there was no overtime for regular season NHL games. When an NHL game ended in a tie score, there was no winner or loser. When the WHA instituted the overtime period, the first team to score during that extra period would win the game. This rule change was considered outrageous, ridiculous, and stupid by the more stuffy and conservative NHL, but at the same time, it was wildly appreciated by the fans. The all too obvious changes in pro hockey brought about by this sudden death overtime, combined with the draw of fresh young players, the influx of freewheeling Europeans, and the contrast between the play of the WHA compared to the NHL, nurtured disdain and horror with the NHL's owners and league officials. By the 1975-76 season, it was evident that some of the WHA franchises were teetering on the verge of financial collapse due to the ever-increasing player salaries. In addition, the two professional leagues had badly strained the talent pool. The WHA commissioner at that time, Ben Hatskin, saw one last opportunity to save the league and get an influx of much-needed cash.
It turned out that Ben Haskins, the commissioner of the league, a very notable character in his own right, called me and he said, he talked like this. He says, I can sell the San Diego team to Ray Kroc, the McDonald's guy. He'll sponsor all our teams on television. And so with a little bit of pressure and a small profit, we sold the team to Ray Kroc.
After about a year of ownership, Ray Kroc decided that hockey was not for him. I purchased the team, the San Diego Mariners. So I actually was in the World Hockey Association as a team owner.
Despite Jerry Saperstein's attempts to shore up the San Diego Mariners after Ray Kroc's departure, there was no hope of getting a huge cash influx into the league from TV sponsorship. The only thing left to save the spirit of the league was for the WHA to consider merging with their arch rivals, the NHL. Merger discussions with the National Hockey League were first initiated in 1977. After a lengthy debate, the NHL voted against the proposal since mergers were unpopular among the NHL team owners, who were still fuming at the WHA for breaking up their monopoly and costing them hundreds of millions of dollars.
Well, just like everything else, salaries kept escalating and escalating, and everybody was starting to lose money. Not only our league, but their league.
You had to have a merger because both leagues were suffering. Damage was being done to both leagues, so it was so obvious.
And at that time I said, guys, you've got your making for a real World Hockey Association now. I said, get to Europe and tie up the Swedes, the Finns, the Czechs. And I said, the Russians will get so sick of playing amongst themselves, they'll come in, and then you'll have a real World Hockey Association. You don't need to be in the NHL, because I said, if you think you're going to the NHL without being raped, you have another thought coming.
However, despite the warnings of Bobby Hull, facing financial difficulty and unable to meet payrolls, cooler heads prevailed, and the WHA finally came to an agreement with the NHL in early 1979. Under the deal, 4 WHA clubs were to join the NHL: the Edmonton Oilers, New England Whalers, renamed the Hartford Whalers, Quebec Nordique, and Winnipeg Jets.
The National Hockey League really and truthfully needed to expand, and they needed to expand intelligently. Rather than attempt to place new franchises, they had successful franchises in the WHA. So the WHA NHL merger was really a business merger, almost a merger of equals.
At that point in time, they decided 4 teams were going to merge in the National Hockey League, and everybody was really excited about it. And they said, all right, each team can protect 2 players. Without sounding egotistical, everybody kind of knew I was going to be one of the guys protected. Right from that point in time, Glenn wanted his team to be patterned after that of what Bobby Hull built with the Winnipeg Jets.
And when the merger came, they asked me, and their goal was to keep the Winnipeg team together. And one of the conditions that the NHL imposed was that they had to break up the Winnipeg Jets in order to let them come in, because the Winnipeg Jets would have won the Stanley Cup 4-0. I mean, they were that good.
Right from that point in time, I think people would have been surprised. And I think the NHL was scared of how they would do. Each of those 4 teams going in would have had 9 or 10 NHL caliber players. Man, that's the hard part, getting 9 or 10 guys that good. And then they could have built around that and could have quickly become very competitive. And I think in a lot of ways the NHL was scared of that.
Just because the WHA records weren't honored after the merger with the NHL and the surviving WHA teams were ravaged by the other NHL teams, it does not mean the World Hockey Association has disappeared in the annals of hockey history and been forgotten. Even today, every professional hockey game played in North America is a living, breathing testament to what the WHA stood for back in the 1970s. In addition, perhaps the most identifiable rule change brought over to the NHL from the WHA was that sudden death overtime period. After the merger, the NHL adopted that rule change thanks to the innovative thinking of Dennis Murphy and Bill Hunter.
The startup of the WHA left a legacy in the National Hockey League today. And certainly Edmonton is as much a part of that as anything. When the WHA and the NHL merged, then you had Winnipeg, you had Quebec, you had Hartford, you had Edmonton, Calgary. Edmonton, certainly with 5 Stanley Cups, made an immediate impression on the National Hockey League and was a good illustration of the quality of play in the WHA, and certainly the whole idea of the WHA has had a huge impact on hockey as it exists today.
Just to let you know what kind of a league we had, the first year that the 2 leagues joined, 79 and 80, after the first year, out of the top 20 scorers that first year, 10 of them were from the WHA.
You know, I don't think they ever received the recognition that they should have received. I mean, there was guys like Gordie Howe and Frank Mahovlich, Bobby Hull playing in the WHA, and it was a tremendous league.
No question about it. People forget Wayne Gretzky came in through the WHA. Mark Messier came in through the WHA. Some great players came in.
In addition, the WHA was not afraid to look outside of the American continent for hockey inspiration. This tactic even carried over to the NHL after the merger. The new combined league began to view and run the sport from a broader perspective. Before the merger, the NHL would recruit virtually all players from Canada. But following the success of the Europeans in the WHA, NHL scouts began looking overseas for the best players that Europe and Russia could offer. As a result, the NHL teams evolved into a truly cosmopolitan league that fans see today, with young players, mature players, American players, Canadian players, and European players. In fact, the NHL today looks more like the WHA than the pre-merger NHL. The World Hockey Association introduced a new international style of play, which is exactly what everybody sees today.
Until the World Hockey came along, there was this, okay, this is the North American way to do it, and then there's the Russian international way to do it. Well, WHA brought that Russian game or that European game to the U.S. and showed that it can be very successful and entertaining. And I think that was one of the major things that the WHA did, and Dennis was responsible for.
The WHA also ended the NHL policy of paying its players only a small and insignificant fraction of the league's profits, and that, combined with the abolition of the reserve clause, led to much higher player salaries.
It's actually to a point where I don't know how much higher the salaries can go, but I think everybody owes Dennis a big thank you for what he's done and what he's done for salaries, what he's done for player benefits throughout the world.
The WHA founders, Dennis Murphy, Don Regan, and Gary Davidson, did the same thing for hockey as they did for basketball when they founded the American Basketball Association in direct competition with the NBA.
Every basketball player and hockey player ought to give a cut of their income to Dennis and Gary and Don Regan and those guys that started the two leagues. They made all the players a lot of money. I mean, we signed guys. I remember the contracts. When I tell you the dollars, you're going to say, "Good Lord!" But you're signing guys that were NHL players that were making 15 to 20 grand and excelling in the NHL, and we're paying them 30 to 35 grand, and people being outraged.
Dennis introducing the World Hockey Association caused quite an uproar with the NHL owners. They were making, quite a bit of money, and it was about time they shared some of the benefits with the players. And I think that if anybody didn't like Dennis from the NHL ownership group, that was probably the reason why.
The WHA's success in Canada ultimately forced the NHL to reconsider other major Canadian cities without NHL teams. There were only 3 Canadian teams in the NHL before 1979, but those highly successful WHA Canadian teams opened the floodgates.
Dennis Murphy created new markets: Hartford, Connecticut, Quebec, Edmonton, Winnipeg, Phoenix, Denver, Cincinnati, Indianapolis. We were in all those markets in the WHA. Some failed, some didn't. So certainly in creating new markets, he was a pioneer.
Look at the value of these franchises that he created in the NBA and the WHA. They are worth billions of dollars today. Had Dennis early on taken a small ownership position in any of these franchises, he would have been one of the richest men in America today. Certainly, he was motivated by doing rather than owning.
So these guys got NHL franchises for next to nothing. I mean, they had to hang tough for a few years. So I love visionaries, and it certainly was very beneficial. Gave a lot of guys careers in hockey that they wouldn't have had, and helped people make some pretty significant money.
There is little question that the NHL is now much stronger because of the lessons learned through the creation of and merger with the World Hockey Association. Just remember the next time a hotshot European skater scores a goal in sudden death overtime to win a game, or a Wayne Gretzky-type teenage phenom joins the NHL before finishing college or junior hockey, or a player signs a multi-million-dollar contract. It's only possible because of the pain, suffering, tenacity, and efforts of the founders, team owners, and players of the World Hockey Association, the true pioneers and visionaries of professional hockey. Collectively, they shaped and molded the NHL into the multi-billion-dollar worldwide powerhouse league it is today.
Dennis really had a vision that no one else really had. And he had the ability to show people a need, a method, and a way to succeed. And many succeeded. Many succeeded.
He has a little bit of Lewis and Clark in him. Over the next ridge, around the next corner, I want to see what's there. Arduous, impossible, never done before, but he's truly a pioneer. And to all pioneers I've ever seen, whether they're space pioneers or sports pioneers or movie pioneers, they had an insatiable drive for success. They had an insatiable drive of curiosity. They had an insatiable imagination. And that's Dennis.
One of the amazing things is that Dennis Murphy's influence is across professional sports today. He founded the American Basketball Association, which then merged with the National Basketball, or the NBA. He created the World Hockey Association, which subsequently merged with the National Hockey League. Not only did he bring 8 or 10 or 12 of the most important teams in America into existence, he created a style of play that has been adopted by the more traditional leagues. Dennis Murphy is a candidate, a valid candidate for inclusion in both the Basketball Hall of Fame and the Hockey Hall of Fame.
To me, I don't think there's any question. The World Hockey's contribution, and Dennis as one of the founders, certainly needs to be and should be recognized by the Hockey Hall of Fame. WHA brought more and more European players into the game. The second thing was allowing the youth, the younger players, the ones that were under 20, because there was an established process in the National Hockey League, and seeing some of these young players, exciting young players at a younger age was good for the game. The combination of the mix of veteran players and younger players and international players created a magical league.
Those are the kind of things that happened in the WHA. So, you know, there were some good times. They're nice people, you know, good people in WHA.
It is quite amazing that the seeds planted by a pioneering and visionary person such as Dennis Murphy would have such a lasting and prominent effect on professional hockey. And it's even more amazing that such a person could be a totally unknown figure in the background, bringing together everyone to create the World Hockey Association.
Please turn your attention to Sunrise as we celebrate the 40th anniversary of the inaugural World Hockey Association season. Here tonight to draw a ceremonial puck is a special guest who played an integral role in bringing professional hockey to oil country. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the man who founded the WHA, Mr. Dennis Murphy. At this time, we will invite Team Captains Joe Ford and Sean Hortbaugh to skate to center ice for the ceremonial puck drop.